All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. My name is Sean Rogers, and I will serve as the moderator for today's event. This is the second in a two-part webinar series, the first of which was held on November 10th, and the recording of that November 10th webinar is available on the National Reentry Resource Center's website. We're also recording today's webinar, and we will send a link to both today's webinar, a recording of today's webinar, as well as to the first webinar in the series, either late this week or early next week. I'll make sure and send that to everybody that registered for this webinar. All right. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center. The Resource Center, now in its third year, was established by the Second Chance Act to provide education, training, and technical assistance to states, tribes, territories, local governments, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and corrections institutions working on prisoner reentry. The Resource Center provides distance learning opportunities, publications, and tools, and a comprehensive website to advance knowledge and training in the field. If you haven't already done so, I would like to encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, which you can do at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. Each newsletter provides the latest research, tools, publications, and funding opportunities in the reentry field. And on this slide, circled in red, is a place where you can sign up on the home page for that newsletter. After today's presentation by our featured speakers, there will be time for a short question and answer session. To ask a question, please type the question into the Q&A panel, which is located on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. If you encounter technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues that you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording this event and will post it on our website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We should have the webinar posted online late this week, and again, once it's been posted, I'll make sure and email you all a link to the recording. All right, move to the next slide here. We are very fortunate to have two distinguished panelist speakers with us today. The first, Jerry W. Bartroff, is the Deputy Director of Offender Services for the Iowa Department of Corrections. He is responsible for administering and overseeing reentry, offender classification and transfer, interstate compact, cognitive behavioral, substance abuse, sex offender, mental health, and domestic violence treatment programs, evidence-based practices implementation, offender education and vocational programs, and community placement. Jerry has worked in corrections for over 25 years in various positions, including statewide reentry coordinator, correctional treatment director, treatment services director, treatment manager, correctional counselor, and correctional officer. He is a member of the American Corrections Association, the Iowa Corrections Association, and a graduate of Iowa Wesleyan College. Nathan Lowe is a research associate with the American Probation and Parole Association, where he works on federally funded projects to conduct research and provide training and technical assistance to the community corrections field. Prior to working for APPA, he worked in adult and juvenile corrections in Kentucky for numerous years in such roles as assessment specialist, alternatives to detention program coordinator, sex offender counselor, and community intensive supervision officer. Nathan's current research explores the development of a risk assessment tool to identify chronic DWI offenders, the influence of strain on criminal and deviant behavior within a community context, and the impact of earned credit on recidivism among parolees. His most recent work has appeared in the Journal of Community Corrections and Journal of Interpersonal Violence. Nathan is currently working towards a PhD in sociology at the University of Kentucky and he received his MS in Correctional and Juvenile Justice Studies from Eastern Kentucky University in 2007. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Lowe.
Thank you, Sean, for that wonderful introduction. Before we get started on the discussion of the content of today's webinar, I'd like to talk a little bit about APPA, that is the American Probation and Parole Association. We're an international association composed of members from the U.S., Canada, and other countries actively involved with probation, parole, and community-based corrections in both adult and juvenile sectors. All levels of government, including local, state, provincial, legislative, executive, judicial, and federal agencies, are counted among our constituents. Over the years, APPA has grown to become the voice for thousands of probation and parole practitioners, including line staff, supervisors, and administrators. Educators, volunteers, and concerned citizens with an interest in criminal and juvenile justice are also among APPA's members. By continuing to effectively provide service to its constituents, APPA represents a strong, unified voice for the field of community corrections. As you can see on our slide here, it's obviously a place on our website, which our website address is found at the top, www.appa-net.org. We're currently conducting a membership drive called Just One. So if you go to our website, if you're not a member and you're interested to learn more, go to our website in the announcements section as the arrow indicates there, and you can learn more about what the memberships, if you become a member, what it provides. Okay. Let me get into discussion of today's learning objectives. The goal of today's training is to educate you, the participants, on the current trends of evidence-based practices, or EBP, of parole supervision, with respect to reentry of parolees leaving prison. As you will read, this training has 4 overall learning objectives. The first one is to gain a general understanding of the core elements of EBP and parole supervision. I will discuss these elements during the first part of the webinar. However, Deputy Director Bartroff will discuss them as well. The second goal is for participants to be able to discuss the pros and cons of EBP implementation. Deputy Director Bartroff will discuss the various ways in which EBP implementation has impacted outcomes such as recidivism and the major challenges of EBP implementation they've experienced or he has experienced in his jurisdictions in Iowa. Third, participants will be able to recognize key leadership abilities and characteristics that have been proven to be conducive to using a successful evidence-based approach. These leadership qualities will be drawn from the literature on EBP and correctional settings, and again, from Mr. Bartroff's practical experience as an administrator in the Iowa Department of Corrections. Lastly, we hope that participants are able to identify at least 2 practices, hopefully more, that they could implement to enhance parole supervision for the reentry of parolees in their jurisdictions. So let's begin with a working definition of EBP, or evidence-based practices, as they specifically relate to the community corrections field. The Crime and Justice Institute, or CJI, which has worked with the National Institute of Corrections on implementing effective correctional management of offenders in the community since 2002, defines EBP as the, quote, objective, balanced, and responsible use of current research and the best available data to guide policy and practice decisions such that outcomes for consumers are improved, end quote. In the case of community corrections, consumers include offenders or justice-involved individuals, victims and survivors, communities, and, of course, other key stakeholders. In addition to this definition, Mark Carey of the Carey Group suggests such decisions should be selected and applied to ensure fair, just, proportionate, and effective sanctioning goals. So now we have a general understanding of EBPs as they relate to community corrections. What's the point? Why is it important for the community corrections field to embrace and implement EBPs, specifically as they relate to parole supervision? Well, in answering this underlying question, let's think back to our consumers. For the justice-involved individuals, or more commonly known as offenders, research has found EBPs to reduce recidivism, regardless of whether we are referring to new arrests, technical violations, or return to prison within a specific period of time, let's say 2 years. For victims and survivors, by reducing recidivism, EBPs can dually reduce victimization and thus prevent future acts of harm doing to such individuals. This is also applicable to neighborhoods and communities in regard to upholding public safety. EBPs can reduce costs that are primarily associated with mass incarceration of offenders, which can then lead to government jurisdictions developing fiscally responsible practices and policies. And by the very nature of implementing EBPs at any agency level, collaborations will form between justice and non-justice agencies in order to increase overall effectiveness. In the end, the evidence-based approach leads to a core quality assurance and evaluation process that involves critically reviewing research literature on the latest EBP trends, ensuring that EBPs are replicated with fidelity, and evaluating new practices or programs to determine their overall effectiveness. So as I mentioned, the Crime and Justice Institute has worked closely with NIC for several years. Well, they've also compiled a coherent framework of 8 guiding principles of effective intervention. The first 3 are noted and provided on this slide. These principles have been developed based on a wide range of research findings and recommendations. Deputy Director Bartra will discuss each or maybe some of these principles at length, particularly as they relate to the implementation of EBPs in Iowa. But I'd like to simply just introduce a little bit and talk briefly about them. The first principle you'll see here is the practice of conducting ongoing assessments to determine the actuarial risk and needs of justice-involved individuals. In this case, parolees or those individuals leaving prison onto parole on community supervision. Conducting an assessment process correctly can lead to the effective case management of parolees, including supervision and identified treatment. The second principle is to enhance the intrinsic motivation of parolees to change their non-conforming behaviors and attitudes to develop a more pro-social lifestyle. The third principle requires a little bit more detail. It deals with appropriately targeting interventions to parolees. This principle encompasses a number of factors, including risk, which commonly known as matching the level of program intensity to the parolee or the individual's risk level, where treatment and supervision resources are reserved for parolees with the highest risk to recidivate. The need principle, which targets interventions to criminogenic needs of the individuals. And responsivity, matching the style and mode of intervention to the parolee's learning styles, abilities, temperament, motivation, gender, and even culture. The dosage, which has to do with the structure of the appropriate amount of time with the treatment level. And treatment, integrating treatment, and particularly cognitive behavioral types, into the full sentencing and supervision process. The fourth principle deals with providing evidence-based programming to justice-involved individuals that emphasizes cognitive behavioral strategies and is delivered by well-trained employees. This may include such training as motivational interviewing or stages of change, both of which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The fifth principle emphasizes the need to increase the positive reinforcement among individuals to promote sustainable behavioral change. In practice, there should actually be a fine balance between holding individuals accountable and providing them with incentives for their behavior. Sixth, and this may be one of the most difficult tasks, realign and actively engage pro-social supports for parolees or individuals leaving prison onto supervision in their natural communities. Research indicates that many successful interventions with extreme populations, that is, inner-city substance abusers, the homeless, or those individuals who have some type of dual diagnosis of substance abuse and mental health issues, actively recruit and use family members, spouses, and supportive others in the individual's immediate environment to positively reinforce desired new behaviors. The final two principles specifically pertain to the organizational process of the agency. Measuring the interventions and services to determine ideal outcomes is essential to evidence-based practices. This includes conducting quality assurance on employees as well. Then, once a method for measuring relevant processes and practices is in place, the information must be used to monitor process and change. This obviously helps to build accountability and maintain integrity in the organization's mission, regardless, again, of the agency's level of supervision and jurisdiction. So, now that we've introduced you to some degree of evidence-based practices and principles of effective intervention, let's look at this slide. This slide illustrates the importance of EBPs for for individuals leaving prison onto parole supervision. So, although many of you may already know this, let's kind of quickly review some of these statistics. We know that about an estimated 2 million inmates are in jail, in prison across the U.S. And of these inmates, about two-thirds, or about 1.4 million, are confined to state prisons. Research has shown that of these state prison inmates, at least 95% of them will be released at some point from prison. Unfortunately, however, about 40% of those individuals will return to prison for committing new crimes or violating their technical conditions within 3 years of release. Other research indicates that two-thirds of these individuals will be rearrested for at least one serious crime within 3 years of release. These statistics reveal an obvious disconnect between the actual experiences of individuals leaving prison during the reentry process from prison and the goals of government officials and corresponding agencies. So, several factors have been identified as challenges to successful reentry. On this slide, we see a list of 7 fundamental challenges developed by Jeremy Travis, one of the most reputable scholars on prison reentry in the country today. Although he has conducted extensive work on the subject, one of his most riveting works came when he was working at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. He conducted a longitudinal study over a 4-year period on the policy challenges of prisoner reentry and the principles for effective reentry, which he has published in his book entitled But They All Come Back, published in 2005. And obviously the citation is listed at the end of the slides. Some of these challenges may be best addressed collectively, such as employment, housing and living conditions, obviously ensuring the public safety of the community as well as the individuals returning. These are typically core issues or factors that community corrections agencies and officers have to be cognizant of in working with individuals once they return to the community. While others post unique features which make them more difficult to effectively address, of course, such as issues relating to the families and children of parolees during the reentry process. Nevertheless, I'm sure most of you are familiar and can agree that each one of these challenges or factors listed here always presents maybe a unique and relentless challenge to the supervision or the effective supervision of individuals returning to the community from prison. So, to address these challenges to successful reentry, several key principles of effective reentry have been identified by research scholars, policymakers, and practitioners alike. The first you'll see here is this notion of preparing for reentry. And this is essentially meaning that reentry begins or should begin when an individual first enters prison, and not necessarily when he or she is leaving prison. And so the reentry plan or the reentry process begins by beginning to identify the individual's criminogenic risk and their corresponding needs, why they're in some type of correctional institution, to begin working through those issues and work to the day to the individual is eligible for parole release or release from prison altogether. The second principle you'll see here is the notion of building bridges. Essentially what this means is, you all I'm sure are very much aware about the collaboration, the work between justice and non-justice agencies and community as it relates to institutional correction. So there's a sense of collaboration, and there's a continuum of services that are being provided while the individual remains incarcerated in prison facility until they are eventually released into the community and continue to be under supervision. The third principle, seizing the moment of release. Obviously, this has to do with developing a sound plan within a specific period of time. 180 days is obviously one of the more common time frames typically used by corrections agencies. But what this plan will be doing is it provides a clear path for both the correctional staff of the agency, the individuals working with the individual, and of course the individual, him or herself. Fourth principle, concentric circle of support. As the name implies, what we're talking about here is the individual's social support system, which typically has to do with the individual's family and friends. So building and working with that circle of support throughout the reentry process. and strengthening the circle of support. The fifth principle has to do with tailoring the conditions of supervision, or also what the APPA's Executive Director Carl Wicklund refers to as the 3 R's. That being realistic, meaning that the conditions of supervision should be few in numbers and attainable by both the agency and the officer, as well as the individual under supervision. Relevant, the conditions should be relevant. That means they should be relevant to the individual's risk and needs. And of course, research-based. That is, that these conditions have been shown to be supported by empirical evidence to produce certain desired outcomes for both the individual and the agency. The sixth principle has to do with front-loading supervision resources. And as we well know within the research with respect to reentry and recidivism, we know that those first few days, weeks, and months after release from prison and once the individual returns to the community are a particularly high-risk period. And so if resources can be allocated to those or front-loaded to provide when the individual first returns to the community from prison, the greater likelihood of success. Place-based supervision has to do with placing officers in geographically based caseloads and possibly having satellite offices physically located in the communities where high concentrations of parolees reside. And finally, successful integration as a systematic goal. This obviously is one of the more, or if not the most important principle here, is that there should be an overall plan and goal of the agency or agencies involved in working with the individuals to reduce recidivism, which obviously includes a systematic plan to evaluate performance measures, to continuously update. And, of course, Deputy Director Bartroff will get into discussion and talking about all of these principles and specifically what they've done in Iowa to implement EBPs with respect to parolees and parole supervision. So let's get to the point. Now we have a general understanding of EBPs, of parole supervision and entry. We will now transition to Deputy Director Bartroff, specific discussion on these practices as they have been implemented in Iowa. In this discussion, I've asked him to address the following underlying points and questions. One, he'll talk about, the evidence-based practices or EBPs that that the state of Iowa, the Department of Corrections, currently employs. And these particularly as they relate to the guiding principles of effective intervention that we previously discussed. Secondly, what impact has the implementation of these EBPs had on certain outcomes, such as recidivism, caseload sizes, costs, things of that nature. Third, what have been the major challenges? Very important from an administrative and organizational standpoint, the challenges of implementing EBPs within his jurisdiction to shed some insight, some light for the attendees. Fourth, of course, in his view, what does he perceive as the essential elements to promote effective implementation of EBPs? And lastly, we've asked him to describe some of the key leadership styles and characteristics that he perceives as most conducive to using a successful evidence-based approach. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Director Bartroff. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be with you today. To begin the presentation, we'd like to talk a little bit about what the evidence-based platform is in Iowa. Our goal is to increase public safety through successful reentry of offenders from prison. And we also think that offenders that are currently under probation supervision are also targets for our reentry efforts. And if we can help probationers remain in the community and not come to prison, we think that we have accomplished our goal, one of our goals. Also want to talk about evidence-based and emerging practices of the Iowa corrections system. I think it's important to take a look at where we've been to help us identify where we're going and to where we want to be. Let me first describe that we currently have approximately 37,500 offenders under correctional supervision in Iowa, and about 3 of those 4 are supervised in community-based corrections. Of the 28,980 in CBC, there are 22,500 folks on probation, 3,400 on parole, 1,735 in residential facilities, and 1,250 on pretrial. As of yesterday's date, there are 8,750 offenders in prison. Again, when we talk about I think it's important to recognize where we've been to understand where we're at today and where we want to go tomorrow. So I'm going to kind of couch this presentation with a bit of a timeline. I think it's important to understand the evolution of the Department of Corrections and community-based corrections in context. And as I go through this timeline, I think each one of these events represents a point of shared history and a point of collaboration. In the Iowa Department of Corrections, there are 8 community-based corrections districts. These districts are independent. Directors are appointed by local boards made up of county supervisors. Funding flows to the Department of Corrections to the districts, providing a mechanism for sharing, collaboration, and some statewide standards and practices. Each year, each CBC district signs a purchase of service agreement with the Department of Corrections, which strengthens statewide coordination and standardization. So that relationship between the Iowa Department of Corrections and the Community-Based Corrections District began in 1983. In 1998, the Department of Corrections and Correctional Services was reorganized to identify 2 regions of the state, the Eastern and Western region. And at the same time, the Division of Offender Services was established. In 1999, we began to implement the use of LSIR to focus on our risk and identifying criminogenic needs. And that has been, that tool continues to be our primary risk and needs assessment in the Iowa Department of Corrections. In 2000, we rolled out what is called ICON in our Iowa vernacular, which means the Iowa Corrections Offender Network. And we first rolled that out to community-based corrections in 2000. The Iowa Corrections Offender Network is a web-based database that is shared by CBC and the institutions that allows us to provide staff all of the information they need about offenders at their desktops. It drives common work processes and provides us with information we need to make data-driven decisions and to measure our outcomes. We share that information from the database with the Iowa court system, with the Iowa Board of Parole, with several law enforcement agencies, and we also dump ICON data into the Justice Data Warehouse, which then allows us to look at outcomes and trends by comparing that with court data as well. In 2003, we participated in the Seriously Violent Offender Reentry Initiative, which was our first grant-funded reentry pilot program in the state of Iowa. For our participation in that program, we were able to see improved outcomes for African American offenders that were in our prison system and were returning to the communities. In 2004, the community-based corrections system began implementing evidence-based practices, and the institutions joined community-based corrections on the Iowa Corrections Offender Network. I'll talk a little bit more about that CBC implementation of EBP as we bring the institutions online with that process in 2006. In 2005, we participated in the Kaizen reentry event, and Kaizen is a Japanese term that means change for the good of all, and it's essentially a business process that looks how you can improve your performance, eliminate handoffs, eliminate waste, and we focused on offender reentry as part of that through this business model, and it did inform us a great deal and led to the development of a reentry system in the state of Iowa that fairly closely mirrored the transition from prison to community model, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. In 2005, we also received the benefit of PRI grants that had an urban focus, and also participated in a mental health reentry grant with the Department of Human Services. In 2006, the institutions began implementing evidence-based practices, and statewide reentry coordinators, and assessment staff at the reception center were funded. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about this process of implementing EBP and CBC in the institutions. We adopted the integrated model of evidence-based practices, which essentially has three dimensions. The evidence-based principles are our content. Organizational development and institutional or organizational changes are internal strategy, and the other dimension is collaboration and external strategy. During that process, we the Department of Corrections and Community-Based Corrections committed themselves to this model and begin the process of implementation by making that one of our major focuses for the next several years. As we began that process, it was important for us to identify internal stakeholders, and those stakeholders were groups that were most affected, and they must have a voice in this process. That leadership was required, and multiple levels of authority must understand the vision, have a voice, and a means to communicate their opinions, and that we needed to involve people at the front end through a diagonal slice of our organizations. Line staff needed to be involved early and constantly. External stakeholders were those people that we've talked about before and Nathan referred to earlier, including some of our consumers, as well as prosecution and defense attorneys, the courts, police, probation, parole, institutions, law enforcement, victims and their families, citizens, and also partners we collaborated in the communities to help provide some of our interventions. As part of that implementation of EBP, we developed EBP core teams in each of our institutions and districts. We then trained those core teams in evidence-based practices during a 3-day EBP retreat. And we drilled deep into the institutions and districts then to make up the EBP core teams. And the core teams then went back to the institutions and districts and pushed down the process of understanding and implementing evidence-based practices in each correctional institution and community-based corrections district. Another element of this process led to the development of the Evidence-Based Practices Steering Committee. And that committee implemented a program audit process, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next few slides. The EBP Steering Committee was comprised of people from community-based corrections, folks from the institutions, as well as central office and administrative staff. We developed a protocol and a list of questions and assessment tools, and we scheduled visits to every district and every institution in the Iowa Department of Corrections. We were specifically looking at identifying those programs that needed improvement, also focusing on those that were promising, and then identifying those problems as excellent to be a vision of where we wanted all of our programs to go. As we made each of those visits, some of the domain areas that we looked at were consistent with what Nathan described as some of the basic evidence-based principles. One of the first things we looked at when we visited each of the sites is a validated risk assessment conducted to determine criminogenic need. And in each of these categories that I'm going to be describing here, we scored that whether that practice was fully implemented, partially implemented, or still needed to be implemented. We further looked at, does the program address one of the LSI identify needs? Attitudes and orientation, emotional, personal, alcohol, drugs, and the other domains of the LSI. We looked at what the criteria were for program placement to ensure that placement in our programs was focusing on risk. That the higher the risk, the greater the dosage and duration of treatment based on risk. We wanted to make sure that we were implementing and using a stage of change to identify treatment readiness, And we wanted to ensure that we reassessed risk to measure whether or not we were effective in our goal of risk reduction. Other things we evaluated were ensuring that we were meeting the responsivity principle and also engaging offenders in enhancing their intrinsic motivation. We assessed the ability to utilize motivational interviewing, incentives, and rewards. And we also wanted to ensure another chief characteristic in making this whole thing work is are the people that are providing treatment matched with the characteristics of the parolee, and are we matching the characters of the parolee to the treatment intervention? We wanted to assess whether or not we were continuing support in the community was a major element in what we're doing, recognizing that we needed to have support from mentors, family members, as well as other folks in the community. We assessed whether the interventions were meeting cognitive behavioral criteria. Were they looking at thinking, feelings, and behavior? Was there skill building and directed practice? Were staff exercising the strength and power of role modeling? And were we using structured time and booster sessions as well as aftercare in our programs? We then looked at the evaluation piece and assessed each program to see if there had been some form of external evaluation. And if there was some form of internal program performance or evaluation data collected. We wanted to ensure that clinical supervision was employed and that the program supervisor had been trained in evidence-based practices and principles, that motivational interviewing those concepts were followed and implemented, and that the programs were specific to the intervention skills of the facilitator. We also wanted to ensure that the program supervisor had been trained in clinical supervision skills and techniques. To accomplish this, when we made the visits to each site, we looked at file information to look at evaluation and assessment tools. We set in on groups and we interviewed the facilitators as well as the offenders that had participated in those groups. We then did a scoring to determine how well these programs were meeting the criteria that we were assessing. And what we found out was that there were some programs that needed improvement, that the need for that improvement was so great that we decided to end some of those programs and focus our program resources on those programs that were promising and excellent. We were able to identify at the time that we did this evaluation, prior to doing the evaluation, that approximately 31% of our programs were promising or excellent. By the time that we completed the evaluation and some action steps were put into place, we were able to move the percent of programs as designated as promising and excellent to 42%. Okay. Next slide is a focus on reentry. In 2007, reentry coordinators began, and we also received a PRI grant that focused on how we could provide reentry services to folks in rural Iowa. As you probably imagine from your thoughts about Iowa, there are some urban areas, but we are a very rural state. And how could we provide and make sure that reentry services were meeting the needs of folks in our rural areas? At the end of that PRI grant with a rural focus, we did an evaluation, and that evaluation noted that the preparation work that was done with individuals while still in prison appeared to be effective. Individuals in the program that began their community interventions were much earlier involved in their interventions than a comparison group. A higher rate of employment was found for offenders who participated in the program as compared to a comparison group. Offender risk levels had decreased while under community supervision. New arrests were lower than they were for the comparison groups that did not receive the rural PRI services. In 2008, the Department of Corrections collaborated with the U.S. Department Bureau of Justice Assistance and hosted a 3-day event in Coralville, Iowa that was entitled Reentry in the State of Iowa, Accomplishments and Planning for the Future. This event was attended by 225 folks, mostly leaders in the Department of Corrections, as well as representatives from faith-based and community organizations, the Veterans Administration, and also folks from Victim Services. During this 3-day conference, offenders learned about the process of reentry and evidence-based practices and how we could institutionalize those principles as our way of doing business. During the event, attendees broke into 10 separate work groups and made recommendations as how we could better move our Department of Corrections and Department of Correctional Services forward into identifying offender success as our primary goal. At the end of the conference, those work groups reported out to the newly formed Iowa Corrections Reentry Team, and they provided recommendations for improvement to help us recraft the way that the Department of Corrections and Correctional Services does work in the state of Iowa to move forward with this concept of offender success. As a result of that, the Iowa Reentry Model was designed, and I'm going to be talking about the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team and the Iowa Reentry Model in the next few slides. But I wanted to talk a little bit about something that happened in 2008 that is very important to our offender success. We were able to receive funding to have Iowa Workforce and Reentry Advisors officed in 3 of our release institutions. These were members of Iowa Workforce Development, and they developed a process of what we call career centers in Iowa prisons. This was an innovative strategy to improve the ability of offenders to find and retain productive employment in Iowa. Just like a person in Iowa would walk into a workforce point of service in the community, we established workforce points of service in 3 of our institutions. The Iowa Workforce Development staff person met with offenders as they were nearing release. They involved in the offenders in career and employment planning assessment. They registered the offenders in the Iowa Jobs database, and they did some automatic job matching for employment that met the offender's skills and abilities. And once registered in this database, that allowed offenders to become involved in case management with workforce development when they were released to the community. These workforce advisors also helped offenders obtain birth certificates and Social Security cards. They provide guidance on transportation issues and referral to statewide licensure reinstatement opportunities. They registered offenders for federal tax credit, as well as providing information on state tax credit and federal bonding programs that they could share with potential employers when they were released. And we also performed the process of job referral, and our goal was to have either employment or an interview set up at release. Now to return to a little bit of discussion about the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team. It's important to moving the institutions and districts forward in developing and implementing the Iowa Reentry Model, and a description of what the Iowa Reentry Model is. The Iowa Corrections Reentry Team, as I indicated, was announced at the conference in 2008. Membership of the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team included the Director of the Department of Corrections, 3 district directors, 3 wardens, members from the Board of Parole, members of the Reentry Coordinator Core Team, the Deputy Directors of Operations and Offender Services, as well as representatives from the Governor's Office. It was designed to be a high-level team that would be responsible for implementing Iowa reentry processes in the Department of Corrections and community-based corrections. The goal of the Iowa Reentry model is to reduce future criminality, victimization, and involvement in the criminal justice system. One of the things that we've done with each time that we identify a team to be involved in this process, whether it be EBP, Reentry, or other teams, is to spend some time first identifying what the team's vision is, what the mission is, and then identifying some process to help us move forward in accomplishing the vision and mission of the team. The vision of the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team was to contribute to offender success by promoting effective reentry principles and ensuring that effective reentry practices are fully implemented within the Iowa corrections system. The mission was to develop and engage offenders, staff, victims, and community in implementing the Iowa Reentry Model. The Iowa Reentry Model will include a defined process and procedures to guide effective reentry from sentencing to discharge, taking into consideration differences in resources in different parts of the state. During the first meeting of the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team, the process involved looking at the recommendations that came from the work groups at the Reentry Conference in 2008. And then using those recommendations to guide us in the development of the Iowa Reentry Model. After a great deal of discussion, the Iowa Reentry Model was identified. And we really do think that this model is consistent with what evidence-based practices inform us, as well as what are some of the strategies of successful offender reentry. The Iowa Reentry Model includes the use of consistent and actuarial risk and needs assessments, effective interventions only that are evidenced to be cognitive behavioral in nature and that their outcomes have demonstrated a reduction in risk, a seamless case management system, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later in the presentation, that risk reduction efforts are our primary focus, that we partner with our folks in the communities to make sure that we have supportive systems in place as offenders return to the community, that we identify effective measures, that training and quality assurance must be in place, that the model is guided by clear policy and other documentation to support and articulate the mission and vision, that a range of incentives as well as sanctions are identified for persons returning to the community. And it's essential that effective communication among all partners that are involved in the process occur, which includes staff in the institution, staff in community-based corrections, the offenders and their families or their support system in the community. A recognition that corrections can't do this work themselves, that we need to develop partnerships both inside and outside of corrections if we are to prepare offenders to be successful and provide opportunities for them to be successful. And we want to ensure that victims have a voice in the process. So that was the development of the Iowa Reentry Model. And a little bit later on in the presentation, I'll describe a process that we recently went through to see how much we are aligned with what that model guides us to be. To continue on with the timeline, in 2009, the mission statement of the Department of Corrections was changed. Up until this point, the primary mission was to protect the public, staff, and offenders from victimization. In 2009, through the leadership of our director, that mission statement was changed to include advancing successful reentry to protect the public, staff, and parolees from victimization. While symbolic on the surface, the new mission statement stresses the importance the DOC places on successful reentry as a key component, helping to make Iowa a safer, better place to live. A decision was made to change the mission of the agency to focus directly on reentry, a conscious decision by department leadership. The focus from leadership on this issue is critical to push the successful reentry concept forward. In 2009, we also had a follow-up conference for attendees that were at the 2008 conference. We received grant funding through the Office of Drug Control Policy to fund 3 additional reentry coordinators in our institutions. And we the governor of the state of Iowa issued Executive Order 15, which established the Ex-Offender Reentry Coordinating Council. The primary goal of the Reentry Coordinating Council is to integrate successful offender reentry principles and practices in state agencies and communities, resulting in partnerships that enhance offender self-sufficiency, reduce reincarceration, and improve the safety of our communities. To improve the safety of our communities through successful offender reentry, it is essential to have leadership at the very highest level of state government to bring the community together and stress the importance of collaborating to establish comprehensive offender reentry programs that make a difference. Chairpersons of the council were the director of the Iowa Department of Corrections and Iowa Workforce Development. State agencies at the table included the Board of Parole, the judges, the public safety, law enforcement, human services, public health, education, housing, as well as faith-based and community organizations that we had already established collaboration with to move the offender success model forward. The vision of the Ex-Offender Reentry Coordinating Council was to integrate successful reentry principles and practices in state agencies and communities, resulting in partnerships that enhance offender self-sufficiency, reduce reincarceration, and improve the safety of our communities. The mission of that group was to establish an integrated system coordinating the planning and provision of offender transitional and reentry services to prepare inmates for successful transition into our communities and to improve opportunities for treatment, employment, housing, and services in the community. This group broke into 5 separate work groups and focused on employment, education, housing, substance abuse, mental health, and public safety. During the course of the following year, these work groups developed reports and identified barriers and proposed possible solutions to address those barriers, which were then given to the governor's office approximately a year ago. The current governor has those recommendations in place, and we anticipate an additional executive order to move that process of implementing some of those strategies to be happening in the not-too-distant future. Also in 2009, through a competitive process, Iowa was selected to participate in the TPC initiative by the National Institute of Corrections. The hard work we invested in securing this assistance is important because even with all the good things that we had going on in Iowa regarding implementation of evidence-based practices and reentry, making the effort to seek out further assistance emphasizes the fact that shaping practices to implement EBP and assure successful reentry is a very difficult, long-term, time-consuming process that requires leadership, tenacity, and commitment. Critical issues and goals of TPC. Primary issues involve multiple stakeholders, that the process of offender successful reentry and reducing recidivism is not solely a corrections issue, that multiple stakeholders need to be involved in a meaningful way, that there is a concentration on reforming systems to make sure that evidence-based practices are implemented and followed, and that reentry is a process that does focus on offender success to reduce recidivism. TPC also identifies that the transition starts at admission, or if we look at our probation population in Iowa, I think it starts when offenders are placed under correctional supervision. Risk reduction reforms are driven by evidence-based practices, and we need to ensure and monitor our performance and evaluate to ensure that we are getting the outcomes that we want. The goal of TPC is to enhance the successful transition of parolees from prison to the community in order to enhance public safety and reduce future victimization through recidivism reduction. TPC reflects a major sea change in the corrections profession, which up until its implementation had focused primarily on punishment and incapacitation as the most realistic strategy in carrying out criminal sentences. Less confidence in our ability to impact an offender's behavior led both correctional institutions and community supervision agencies to focus mostly upon custody, control, supervision, and compliance. TPC reflects the understanding that these strategies alone have not demonstrated success in reducing recidivism and ultimately in protecting public safety. Virtually all incarcerated offenders will return to the community at some point. TPC reflects the field's best thinking about how strategically we can enhance public safety, reduce recidivism by encouraging successful transition. The TPC model, which there is a site here on this slide that you can go to get this in more clear detail. It's a fairly large model, as maybe you can see, so it may be hard to read some of the things that are described in that model here. But I will describe this model to you, and I would encourage you to go to the site to be able to view it in greater detail. Based on the work of practitioners and researchers, the TPC model paints a picture of how transition processes can and should look. It poses a set of stakeholders, activities, and resources operating as a seamless whole. This graphic depicts the flow of offenders through time from sentencing through discharge. Across the top of the model are depicted the key systems actors. The segments from left to right depict stages and activities, emphasizing how they must be connected and how various steps group into institutional, reentry, and community phases. This is a process that begins at the time of admission to prison or when placed under correctional supervision. It includes valid, empirically based assessments of risk and needs, a case plan and management process that focuses appropriate programs to higher risk offenders based on their criminogenic needs, utilizes staff offender interactions to enhance motivation and encourage success, anticipates release by planning to meet needs for community stability, continues to supervise and case manage based upon risk and needs, and that involves key stakeholders and collaboration efforts to support these processes. It is not so much that any one of these aspects that make TPC distinctive, but rather that all are included. There is an understanding that for transition to be more successful, we need to identify and implement changes on many levels, in many dimensions, and with many stakeholders. TPC is operating at the state level, the local, county, and city level, enlisting partners and changes in all of them. This next slide describes a roadmap for implementing the TPC model. There are a structured set of activities that you really do have to undertake in order to bring about this kind of change. This depicts an evolutionary process beginning with building teams of stakeholder partners, each with a stake in working toward better outcomes. Moving through clarifying vision and mission. Doing a good job of understanding what is currently in place. What kind of resources are there? What policies are available? What information do we have at our disposal? What are skills of staff that are currently engaged in the reentry process? It includes identifying where practices can be reshaped to fit with evidence-based practice, doing what works. And of course, all these steps have to address the various decision points and stages of transition process. And supporting this, illustrated as a sort of base at the bottom of the chart, are committed leadership, shared vision, collaboration across traditional boundaries within and outside the criminal justice system, good information for decisions, evidence-based practice, and a commitment to systems change, identifying common interests and mutual benefits. a little bit easier to see and understand, I think, model that maps out what the reentry process looks like in Iowa, trying to a little bit simplify some of the models that we just looked at that describe the TPC initiative. Reentry in Iowa is identified as utilizing evidence-based practices and creating partnerships to prepare offenders to be pro-social members of the community without supervision. It involves collaboration between the institutions and community-based corrections, and it must put into place an intake process that assesses offenders for risk and needs, a risk management and risk reduction phase, a transition from prison to the community phase. Typically in Iowa, that begins at 6 months prior to release. And we engage our partners in community corrections at that point in the transition process. We want to ensure that offenders are released to the community with at least 6 months left under supervision, and that we then begin to prepare for aftercare and discharge. As you can see by looking at this model, there are several processes that we follow in the institutions and the districts, including risk and needs assessment. In the institutions, we focus on custody level. In the districts, we focus on level of supervision. We share in common identifying interventions to address needs, and that planning for reentry is essential to and a shared process in both the institutions and community corrections. Reentry should involve focusing on employment, family reunification, safe and secure housing, and aftercare. And we think that by implementing this model that we are able to reduce recidivism and that we can improve the quality of life for offenders, their families, and our communities. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at the different phases and kind of fleshing out what some of the processes and some of the activities in each one of these phases involves. The assessment phase begins at admission. If we look at admission to the prison system, we have implemented an assessment process at the reception center that includes these elements. We will perform a custody classification process that we recently validated a new tool and implemented in 2009. That includes an initial assessment, custody classification assessment, as well as a reassessment tool. There also is an initial assessment for female offenders and a reassessment tool for female offenders as well. We've also tied into our custody classification looking at some community stability or instability of factors for offenders entering the system. And we've also, in the reassessment tools, we've provided an opportunity for offenders to earn points off their custody designation by satisfactory participation in work and treatment programs. We administer the LSIR and justness inventories at initial reception. We also perform a level of service substance abuse assessment that identifies offenders that have substance abuse issues, what level of treatment they need, ranging from intensive inpatient to aftercare. We invest a great deal of time and effort in psychological screening and assessment. We identify and test for offenders' intelligence, their test of adult basic education. In the past couple years, we have implemented a traumatic brain injury screen. And the assessment phase also includes the beginning of establishing the foundation of the reentry case plan. We begin to have that discussion with offenders through staff at the reception center to identify what these assessments are telling us, what we think reentry looks like, some of the things that offenders will be expected to do while they are under supervision in the correctional system, and what supervision will look like in the community, and begin to engage offenders in the process of identifying the case plan as their plan that will help increase the likelihood of success when they return to the community. The next phase is the transition or the risk management and risk reduction phase. After the assessment phase is completed at the reception center, offenders are assigned a facility that best meets their custody, treatment, and reentry needs. We try to send offenders to the lowest level of custody that's consistent with public safety, and we try to assign them to facilities that are near the areas in the state where they are returning to. Within 60 days of admission to this next facility following reception, the reentry case plan is negotiated between the case manager and the offender. The reentry case plan is a living document that is entered into our Iowa Corrections Offender Network system that contracts offender reintegration needs and actions. It begins by prioritizing the top 4 crimogenic needs. It identifies the strengths and challenges that offenders face in each of the need areas. The reentry case plan is structured to be an interview guide that helps the offender move through the process with the case manager and incorporates motivational interviewing techniques and also stages of change. It identifies a stage of change for each need area. It identifies the interventions that are applicable to address the risk and needs of each offender. It identifies goals and action steps for each need. It describes the benefits that offenders will achieve when these goals are met. It also provides an opportunity for the case manager and the offender to talk about higher risk behaviors and what are some red flags that we should be cognizant of. It also includes what does pro-social behavior look like and how can we see when offenders are beginning to behave in a more pro-social manner. It also discusses restorative justice issues and begins the process of developing a transition plan that is both consistent with what the case manager believes that ensures offender success, as well as what the offender thinks is in his or her best interest. The transition phase begins approximately 6 months prior to anticipated release. By that point, we hope that we have offenders housed in minimum custody facilities that are near the communities that they are releasing to. Our intent is that the primary core programs that reduce risk have been, the offender has participated in those prior to becoming involved in this transition phase. The reentry case plan is renegotiated and updated to include an increased focus on transition planning. The primary focus during the transition phase is focusing on those life skills that offenders need to be cognizant of when returning to the community, including interviewing skills, resume writing, balancing a checkbook, those things that the offender has not had to do while they've been incarcerated. We also focus on meaningful work, and many of our offenders in minimum custody facilities are working in the community, many of them working in private industry, and many of them working under supervision of folks in the community and not correctional staff. And again, the focus is on reentry and release planning. As I indicated, the reentry case plan is renegotiated and updated. Staff and the offender prepare for review by the Board of Parole. And during this process, we are involving folks in community-based corrections that will be supervising this offender upon his release, as well as other community partners in the reentry planning process. And some of these other partners include faith-based and community organizations that begin to provide a circle of support and accountability for offenders as they're nearing release, the establishment of mentors when we can, and also engaging the offender's family and social support in that reentry planning. The release phase then begins after the Board of Parole has granted a release. And our goal is to ensure that at least 6 months of supervision remains by the time that the offenders are released to parole. Staff in community-based corrections have hopefully been involved in working with the offender prior to that release opportunity, and they have seen the risk and needs assessment that have been completed in the institutions, and they will review those risk and needs assessments and, if necessary, reassess risk and needs as those risk and needs focus may change and should change upon return to the community. The level of supervision is determined. The reentry case plan that the offenders had participated in the institutions is now renegotiated and updated to include focusing on community stability factors. Offenders are assigned to interventions or continuing care that are again designed to reduce risk. We want to try and engage family and pro-social associates both in supporting the offender but also involved with our parole and probation officers in the intervention and supervision process. We work closely with partners in the community to help offenders find employment and secure housing, and we begin that process of aftercare and discharge planning. To kind of further conceptualize what happens in the release phase, cited at the end of this presentation is a document called Putting Public Safety First, the 13 parole supervision strategies to enhance reentry outcomes. And one of the things that our parolees and staff and case managers in the community, as well as administrative staff, have done is to implement the 13 strategies, which continue to be are a continuation of the same kind of processes that we've used with offenders as they work through the prison system. To define successes as recidivism reduction and to measure our performance, to tailor the conditions of supervision matched to offender risk and needs, to focus our resources on higher risk offenders, to front-load supervision resources, to implement earned discharge as an incentive, to do our best to supervise offenders in their natural communities and engage the natural communities in the supervision process, to engage partners that can help us in expanding our ability and capacity to deliver interventions that reduce risk and needs, to continually assess risk and needs, to balance surveillance and treatment in case plans, to continue to involve offenders in the supervision and treatment process, to engage in formal social controls with partners in the community, with partners in the families and pro-social associates of the offenders, to ensure that we use incentive and rewards to reinforce the behavior that we are looking for, and to respond to violations with swift and certain sanctions. As we talked about all through this presentation, a critical part of evidence-based practices and also successful reentry processes to measure our performance and outcomes and to ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we expect to get, and also to guide the process to make sure that the process that we have established is yielding both the short-term performance measures as well as the outcomes. In the state of Iowa, we've identified these performance measures and outcomes. As far as process, we are measuring the assessed criminogenic needs, the percent of required LSI assessments that are completed. We are also attempting to do our best to ensure that LSIRs are quality, and we continue to try to develop and ensure that quality assurance takes place. Another process that we're measuring are the reentry case plans that I've described. Are those being completed? And looking at the percentage of folks returning to our communities who have those case plans completed. We also think if we're being effective with our reentry process, that the amount of time that it takes from when an offender is granted release to the time that they return to the community should be reducing. So we're measuring parole processing time, which is defined as the median time from when the order for release is ordered to when that offender begins supervision in the community. We look at that from the perspective of the institution that they are being released from, as well as the Department of Correctional Services or Community-Based Corrections program that the offender is releasing to. We also look at institutional preparation and readiness for change. We look at the percent of parolees that completed successfully the interventions that they were assigned to in the correctional system. We also look at the percentage of medium to high risk offenders that received intervention to address their top 4 priority needs. When offenders return to the community, we begin the process of measuring what we call community stability factors. And those community stability factors are stable housing. So we look at the number of address changes that offenders have had, and we have found a relationship between the number of address changes an offender has and the likelihood of being involved in technical violations. We look at alcohol and drug use. Specifically, we look at this measure by looking at the percentage of UAs and BAs that are positive and indicate that controlled substances are not being used. We look at the employment rate, recognizing that offenders that are involved in meaningful full-time employment are more stable in our communities. So we measure the percent of high normal and above parolees that are employed, as well as looking at the job retention element of employment. We also look at restitution plans to make sure that those restitution plans are being met and ensuring that offenders are making regular payments. And to reiterate one of the performance measures in the institutions, we're also measuring the percent of medium to high risk offenders that are receiving interventions for their top 4 criminogenic needs. Then when we look at outcomes, we are measuring revocations, technical violations of probation or parole, the percent of probation revocations for other than new charge. We are measuring revocations of parole, work release, or OWI, percent of parole, work release, or OWI revocations for other than new charge. Then we're measuring recidivism, percent of parolees with new felony convictions within 3 years of release, and also recidivism is defined by return rate to prison, percentage of parolees return to prison within 3 years of release. So those are our performance measures and our outcome measures. To look at things from a fairly high level, this is our return rate to prison for offenders that were released in 2000 and followed for 3 years, offenders that were released from prison in fiscal year 2004 and followed for 3 years, and offenders that were released from prison in fiscal year 2007 and followed for 3 years. The first set of bars in the graph are for female offenders. For offenders that were released in 2000, the recidivism rate was 27.8%. That increased to 32.5% for the cohort of offenders, female offenders released in 2004, and then was reduced to 25.4% for the cohort of offenders that were released to community in fiscal year 2007. The recidivism rate for males was higher. For offenders released in 2000, the recidivism rate was 32.9%. That increased to 34.2% for 2004 releases, and then dropped down to 33.0% in fiscal year 2007. So overall, our recidivism rate for 2000 was 32.4%. 33.9% for offenders released in 2004, and slightly under 32% for offenders released in 2007. I should explain a little bit about some of this data. because we had lower recidivism rates for the 2000 group of releasees, and then that increased after we had implemented some of our evidence-based practices in the beginning of our reentry process for people released in 2004. And one of the things that happened beginning around 2004 was the length of stay in prison began to increase pretty dramatically. And the research tells us that offenders with the longest time served generally had higher recidivism rates than offenders with shorter amount of time served. We also began to experience an increase in the number of offenders that were released from prison at expiration of sentence and therefore did not have the benefit of supervision in the community. Those trends continued with the 207 releases, but our efforts to implement evidence-based practices and then to improve the reentry process resulted in a recidivism reduction. And our goal is that as we continue to measure recidivism, that we can gradually continue to increase that, to decrease that recidivism rate. The process of moving forward with evidence-based practices and successful reentry continues in the Iowa Department of Corrections. In 2010, the Advancing Successful Reentry Team was established, and I'll go back and talk about that team in a little bit greater detail in just a minute. We also received a Second Chance Act to focus on establishing a therapeutic community program for female offenders that was also consistent with our women offender case management model that we had implemented. The Executive Order 15 report was issued to the governor. We then in 2011 began this process of advancing successful reentry pre-audit process. And I'll talk about that just a little bit and then begin to close out the presentation. The Advancing Successful Reentry Team was a team that was established to go out to every institution and district around the state, similar to what we did with evaluating our cognitive behavioral programs back in 2007. We identified this team as a group to establish a pre-audit process. We would go out to the various institutions and districts around the state and determine what our current practices, policies, procedures, and what are the perspectives of staff in how we were doing in accomplishing the elements of the Iowa reentry model, which I described previously. Members of the Advancing Successful Reentry Team included staff from every institution and every district. It included a diagonal slice of staff that ranged from deputy directors to district directors to wardens to reentry coordinators to case managers. What we were doing was to develop and document a baseline of current processes and practice, and then to make recommendations to the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team as to how we could better move our system forward to accomplishing the mission and vision of the Iowa Corrections reentry model. So we assessed the use of consistent and actuarial assessments of risk and needs. We determined if we were effective in using those interventions only on moderate to high risk offenders, that there was a seamless case management system in place. The risk reduction was our primary focus, that there was a range of supportive systems in place, that there was effective measurement, that training and quality assurance were in place, that there was clear policy and other documentation, that a range of incentives and sanctions were identified for offenders, that there was effective communication amongst all partners in the process, that there was a building of partnerships inside and outside of corrections, and the assurance that victims had a voice. We're just now in the process of developing and documenting all of those visits that occurred and to establishing what that baseline was to identify some of the gaps in the process, which will then lead us to make recommendations to the Iowa Corrections Reentry Team to strategically address. From our review so far, we think that we're making good strides in the use of consistent actuarial assessment of risk and needs. We did hear from staff that we could use some training in utilizing the JESNIS to be helpful in meeting the responsivity need. We also found out that there were some concerns about ensuring that quality assurance was taking place because we've experienced a reduction in staff and supervisors over the past several years. When we looked at our interventions, it was obvious that the capacity to provide the interventions to reduce the risk of high and moderate risk offenders, the capacity did not match the need. There was effective core programs, but we needed to try to find a way to increase the capacity. The case management process was described a lot, and people understood and appreciated what the case management process looked like, but several staff indicated that the reentry case plan, the data entry required for that, sometimes got in the way of establishing a meaningful interaction with the offender. That the reach in and reach out process was sporadic, but when it did happen and community-based corrections was involved in transition planning, that the outcomes were better, and that it did save some work for the parole officer when that offender was returned to prison. We did receive confirmation that risk reduction was a primary focus both in our institutions and in our districts. There were a range of supportive systems in place. However, we did identify some barriers in rural versus urban areas, that there were some challenges in getting our offenders with dual diagnosis to mental health, substance abuse treatment agencies when they were returned to the community. There were also some gaps in the ability of staff in the institutions to help offenders enroll in Social Security disability, birth certificates, and to get driver's license. We did feel that there was effective measurement that was happening in most jurisdictions of the states, in the state, but there was a need to give more of a dashboard kind of representation of those community stability factors so that people knew where they were at today with those factors that contributed to community stability. As I indicated before, training and quality assurance were one of the areas that we identified some gaps. We think we can do a better job in our pre-service training to train staff in the principles of evidence-based practices and also in what successful reentry looked like. There were a couple models out there. The Fort Dodge Correctional Facility, which is a medium custody facility, had recently implemented and delivered a 3-day reentry training to all staff at their institutions, and there was an increase in staff at all levels being more involved with case managers in the case management process, also more involvement in using responsivity to help guide the interactions with the offenders, and an increase in looking for incentives and identify opportunities to positively reinforce offender behavior, positive behavior. So identified that there are some areas where clear documentation and policy is lacking, and those areas were articulated, and we will be working with the Iowa Corrections Reentry team to identify some of those policy gaps. There was a recognition that there is effective communication amongst all partners, but that we continue to try to expand our capacity to provide and engage mentors, circles of support, and accountability in the process. And just like corrections, there was some difficulty in establishing partnerships with some of our state agencies, as they had also incurred some reduction in staff due to budget constraints, so there was some work to do in that area. And for the most part, the feedback that we got is that victims, a recognition that victims do have a voice by including them in circles of support and accountability, and also engaging them in the reentry case planning process. So, as I said, there's a whole bunch of data that we're gathering from these visits, and we are in the process of documenting what happened at each one of the sites that we visited, and then looking at the process from a statewide level to identify where we are, what are some of the gaps, and begin the process of strategically planning to address those gaps. We continue to focus on evidence-based practices and reentry as our way of doing business in the state of Iowa, both to reduce risk and to reduce the number of offenders we serve both in the institutions and in the community. And one of our biggest challenges is to continue to improve our response to offenders in prison and offenders in the community that have mental illness. We were excited to become involved in a statewide process to redesign the mental health delivery system in the Department of Corrections in the state of Iowa. And we're invited to be partners by the Department of Human Services in that redesign process. And we also were pleased that the mental health redesign identified jail diversion and reentry for offenders with mental illness as a core service. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. 40% of our population in the prison has a mental illness diagnosis, and about 25% have a serious mental illness. So that is one of our populations that we have the greatest need to improve our response to, as they are also a group of people who return to a prison at a fairly high rate. As the Department of Corrections has moved through, there are 3 publications that are very helpful that NIC has published, and those are cited here. One is the TPC Reentry Handbook, implementing the NIC transition from prison to the community model. Another publication entitled Increasing Public Safety Through Successful Offender Reentry, Evidence-Based and Emergency Practices in Corrections. And the TPC Case Management Handbook, an integrated case management approach. Those documents, as well as our technical assistance from NIC to implement the TPC model, have been tremendous assets for us. To summarize the Iowa correction system, and we really think that we are moving into a time in our organization where the lines between the Department of Corrections and community-based corrections continue to blur and continue to be more of an Iowa corrections system. We advance successful reentry of offenders to protect the public, staff, and offenders from victimization by creating partnerships and utilizing evidence-based practices to prepare our offenders to be pro-social members of our communities without correctional supervision. Offender success is our goal. Reentry is our process. Evidence-based practices are our tools, and our staff are our greatest resource. Jason,
okay.
Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. And I think for the sake of time, we'll skip the recap slide here, as well as just briefly mention that here's some additional resources that you could go to and utilize that relate to the content of this webinar. In specific, I just wanted to particularly note two of those in relation to the initiatives in NIC, and the second one, the NIC's paper series for paroling authorities and supervision agencies. This is largely based upon a comprehensive framework for paroling authorities in an era of evidence-based practices, a publication authored by Nancy Campbell that was published in 2008. And lastly, the September 2011 issue of Federal Probation, a journal that is published with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Within this publication, it's a special issue on evidence-based practices in action. And so obviously the Federal Probation and Pretrial Services System, on which some of the attendees may very well work in that agency or that system, have implemented numerous organizational changes to improve its outcomes. And so within this issue that's cited here, some of those changes are discussed, including the adoption of an actuarial risk and needs assessment tool called the Post-Conviction Risk Assessment, or the PICRA, the PCRA, and a staff training aimed at reducing rearrest, or their STAR training. Please give those a look. There's some very good work being done, again, at the federal level that possibly could relate to the work that's being done at the state and local level. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sean to moderate the Q&A session. I know we went past our time, but please bear with us, and hopefully we'll get some of your questions and we can answer them sufficiently. If not, please follow up with me and my email address is provided here, or Sean, and after the presentation or the webinar, and we'd be more than happy to address your questions as possible. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Let's quickly hop in and see if we can answer a few of these questions. Mr. Bartroff, I have a question. A person wants to know, how do you reassess risk reduction over time? Do you use multiple administrations of the LSI?
Yes, we do use multiple administrations of the LSI.
All right.
And those are usually event-driven, like following an intervention, or if there is an increase in violation behavior. So we do that as driven by events.
All right. Great. Another person has a question about the LSI. They want to know, is it expensive for the state to use it?
We have entered into a contract with Multi-Health Systems that makes it a reasonable investment, we think, for the amount of information that helps guide us in our risk reduction and addressing criminogenic needs efforts. So we think there is some investment, but it's well worth the cost.
All right. Another listener wants to know about staff fidelity in terms of EBP implementation. How do you assess staff and if they're following EBPs?
Yes, we've shifted our evaluation process, our quality assurance model from things to quality. We attempt to observe and to sit in and to observe an offender or a staff person working with their offenders to ensure that the concepts of motivational interviewing, of positive reinforcement, of skill building and guided practice are followed. So quality assurance is our primary way of doing that, and we're trying to shift from measuring things to measure the quality of our interactions and what we are doing with offenders. That ability to do that kind of work has been taxed as we have as some budget issues have resulted in a reduction in both case managers and in supervisors in Iowa over the last 2 years.
All right. A person wants to know if the ex-offender reentry coordinating council, do you include any ex-offenders on that?
Yes, we do. I didn't mention that, but there are 2 ex-offenders that were members of that council. And we consider ex-offenders that are doing well as one of those groups of people that we want to partner with and to continue to learn more from.
All right. Another listener has a question about gender and wants to know if gender is taken into consideration with respect to programming, or if it's universal programming for both men and women.
Yeah, in Iowa, we recently rolled out in our institutions a new custody classification instrument that replaced a one-size-fit-all instrument that had an initial assessment and a reassessment for both male and female offenders. We're also actively involved and have been for quite some time in implementing the women offender case management model, which is similar to the reentry process that I described, where We began to provide gender-responsive programming to female offenders and engage the community while the offender is still involved or still incarcerated to plan for release and to guide that transition planning. We've also made some changes in some of our community corrections districts that as female offenders move through different levels of supervision from probation to parole, that they maintain the same case manager because we think with females it's important to have that consistent relationship with our case managers if we're going to be successful with them.
Great. All right. One final question here, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. One of the listeners wants to know, how has the program worked in rural communities that have fewer program providers, fewer service providers?
That continues to be a process, but one of the things that we've learned as we've gone out and done these reentry pre-audits and the experience that we learned from our PRI grant that focused on rural areas is that it requires staff that are working in those areas to be creative, and that oftentimes instead of relying on collaboration with other partners that may not be there, that the probation and parole officer takes on more of that role of helping offenders get the services that they need to gain employment, to find housing, to manage mental illness or substance abuse. But there's got to be a better way than that because, but that's our strategy at this point, and that seems to work well, but we're losing some of our resources to do that.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bartroff. Mr. Lowe, any concluding comments?
No, I just would like to reiterate that I'm sure we didn't address everyone's questions. It seems a number of questions were posed as I was trying to follow them. So, again, as our email addresses are provided, if you have any questions or comments whatsoever, please feel free to give us shoot us an email or give us a call. And like I said, we'd be more than happy to address any questions or concerns you have that went unanswered.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bartroff, any concluding comments?
None at this time. I recognize that Iowa is a smaller state and doesn't have some of the issues that larger states have, and I'm kind of grateful to be working in the state of Iowa. And I hope that there are some things that folks learn from our experience that can be helpful to them. So thanks for allowing me to participate.
Thank you for joining us today. All right, this concludes the Evidence-Based Practices of Community Supervision Part 2 webinar. After you exit the webinar, a brief survey will appear on the screen. By answering the questions in the survey, you will be helping the Resource Center improve on the services we offer. We'd greatly appreciate it if you would take just a few minutes to complete the survey. Thank you all for your attendance and participation, and a special thank you to Mr. Bartroff and Mr. Lowe. We will email a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint slides used in the presentation late this week. These links will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center's website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. Thank you.